Welcome to Third Floor Views, a production of Chesapeake Family Life, where we talk about health, education, and living with kids. I'm your host, Laura Boycourt. Today, I am thrilled to have award-winning poet, author, and educator Zetta Elliott here to discuss her writing, her most recent book series, and representation in children's literature. Zetta, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. If you could start by introducing yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background as a writer.
Sure. So it won't be too long before folks hear my accent. I have lived in the US for, I think coming up on 30 years, but I'm an immigrant. I was born in Canada. I grew up there and did not have very much representation at all in terms of seeing kids who look like me in books. My mother was my kindergarten teacher. Both my parents were teachers, so I was very fortunate that the culture at home was pretty much like the culture at school. We didn't own a lot of books. Books are pretty expensive, but we had library cards from an extremely early age, and I have vivid memories of walking with my brother and sister up to the library every week, hanging out there, collecting books, checking them out, and then coming home, and we would just lie on the floor and read. So I feel fortunate in the sense that my mother read to us. Then she was my kindergarten teacher, and Ezra Jack Heats was her favorite author. So I did have his books in the classroom. That was pretty important. But every other book I read centered white children. And I didn't have a problem with it at the time. I just thought that's how it is. And especially in terms of fantasy fiction, I thought, of course, white children get to have all the wonderful adventures because all the wonderful adventures happen in England. I didn't know there were children of color in England. I mean, there's just so much you don't know as a child. And then you think books are showing you this larger world, which they really were. But by the time I got to graduate school, 20 years later, I had a Black feminist lens to look through the books I had read as a child, and I could see just how problematic they were, not just in terms of race, but gender and class. And many of them were imperialist because of the British Empire, and really problematic. So I think I find myself writing back to the books that I read as a child, the books where I felt erased or marginalized, or the books that had problematic or inaccurate historical information. My goal primarily is to tell a good story. I think I've been a storyteller from a very early age. I like having an audience. As the youngest in my family, it was pretty hard to get attention. But if you tell a good story, folks will listen.
That's right.
So that became my goal.
Great. And you've done children's literature, poetry, essays, and I think books. Is it 40? Did I read 40 books you've published, something like that?
41. Next week we'll make 40.
Wow. Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
So your sort of expertise as a writer comes in all forms. Anything in particular that that you've enjoyed the most between the essays, poetry, children's literature, or do you kind of enjoy dabbling in all of those?
I do. I find that, speaking to multiple audiences really sort of pushes me as a writer. And because I'm an educator, I was a college professor for 10 years. I've worked with kids for 30 years. I'm always sort of slipping on and off my professor hat and thinking how you were just saying as well, because you have experience as a middle school teacher, that you think about how will this book be used in the classroom? So I do often think, how could a teacher engage this moment in this particular text in a larger conversation about X, Y, or Z? I get asked all the time, what do you do about writer's block? And the great thing about writing in multiple genres is that you just switch gears.
That's right. That makes sense.
Like if you're stuck, when I'm writing a novel, I have an outline, so I don't get stuck because I know exactly where I'm going. I'm just following my outline. But I do find that writing for me is 70% dreaming. So I'm really fortunate at this point in my career that I write for a living and I don't have a day job and I don't have a spouse or kids or a pet to take care of. I have a lot of dream time. And so when I do finally sit down to write a novel, I can write fairly quickly. In the meantime, in between time, I did finish a picture book over the Christmas holiday. And then I feel a little flat when I finish a project. And so I write haiku. And I open a new document and try to write a couple of haiku every day. And that just keeps sort of the creative juices flowing. But I think as long as you're feeding your imagination, writer's block for me generally isn't an issue. And writing poetry and essays, and plays. It's a way to reach a different audience. I'm just taking up puppetry. I had a
Oh,
fellowship
exciting.
last
Yeah.
year, and I'm starting a class next week. And, I think for the most part, I'm interested in still engaging with children, but there are so many adults who have unresolved stuff from their childhood as I do.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
writing for kids is therapeutic for me. And I often get emails from parents saying, thank you, because I needed this book
Oh.
too. And I didn't have this book when I was a child. And people, it's frustrating because when we talk about representation and why it matters so much, nobody wants to talk about the harm.
Mhm.
Folks are interested in
Mhm.
book bans and banning books and why that's bad for kids. And they don't think about what it's like for kids of color, for disabled children, for LGBTQ children, kids who never get to see themselves in a book. When you feel erased, when your reality isn't validated, that causes harm. That causes problems with your self-esteem. That will diminish your interest in reading if we
Mhm.
want to talk about
Mhm.
a literacy gap. So I think many of us are still sort of recovering from loving books that didn't love us back when we were kids. And there are more options now, which is fantastic, but we still have a long way to go.
Absolutely. And I think you have your own imprint, Rosetta Press. And I did a little sleuthing, and I think on the website, it says your mission was to generate culturally relevant stories that center children who have been marginalized, misrepresented, and/or rendered invisible in children's literature. You've already basically touched on this, but it seems like your goal was to, as you were just saying, sort of to create the means to get those stories, to get those specific stories and that representation to the readers who need it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's frustrating to think about the publishing industry because on the one hand, I have this super successful Dragons in a Bag fantasy series,
Mhm.
and that is really what it's enabling me to be an independent writer. But people think that once you've had a successful book or an award-winning book, that editors just will publish everything you write. That's
Not
not
so.
true,
Yeah.
right? I have 25 picture book manuscripts sitting on my hard drive. And,
Mhm.
every few months, I just look at what I've got and think to myself, there's a kid out there that needs this book. And so I better make it myself. And the advantage of self-publishing is that it's much faster. I
Mhm.
can publish an illustrated picture book in 2 to 3 months. And in
Wow.
the traditional industry, it's 2 to 3 years. And then a hardcover book, when we think about the benefits of having a home library, it's such a privilege to grow up in a
Mhm.
home full of books because books are expensive. Brand new picture books are almost $20 because they're hardcover. And these days I'm noticing many publishers are not releasing the paperback a year or two later. They're just sticking with the hardcover.
Mhm.
Paperback books are more affordable. So when I'm self-publishing, yes, I am definitely trying to center kids that haven't held the center in the past, but I'm also trying to create affordable books. My books range from $7 to $10. They're
Mhm.
much more affordable, and that means it's possible for more people to build a home library and to have those kinds of books in the home, because we know that kids that grow up with books in the home, they do better in school, they stay in school longer, even if the books aren't read to them. Simply having
Mhm.
books on a shelf in your
Mhm.
home is a benefit. So I think about that when I'm self-publishing. I'm doing a book right now called Chicken Wonders Why. And
Ooh.
it's because a parent in Tennessee tried to have a traditionally published book of mine, A Place Inside of Me, banned. And she stood up and testified at the school board meeting and said, whatever happened to books, kids' books about chickens? So I was like, oh, I can write a book about chickens. And I
Challenge
did.
accepted. Yep.
Exactly. Wrote it in a couple of hours, and then connected with my illustrator, Purple Wong, who's in Hong Kong. She's amazing. We've done about 7 books, and she started immediately. And that book will be out this month. So, self-publishing has been a really empowering tool for me. I see it as a tool of resistance, so that if you have a big system, a publishing industry that's closing the door more often than not in the faces of marginalized writers, you have
Mhm.
an option. You have another option.
Well, that's wonderful to have. Absolutely. And you mentioned your Dragons in a Bag series, which is published by Random House, I believe, and I just devoured them. My one of my older daughters, she read a little bit, but I kind of wouldn't let her, have the book. I mean, I just devoured them. And again, as a formal middle grade literature teacher. I love them. I could go on forever. Anyhow, it's urban fantasy for middle grade readers. What was your inspiration and your attraction to fantasy? I think you touched on it before that historically, traditionally, certain children have access to magic in very certain specific areas. What about that made you want to take this up?
I mean, it's really funny because as an adult, like by the time I was in graduate school at NYU in the mid 90s, if you had said to me that I was going to be writing fantasy fiction, I would have just looked at you with such contempt, like, I
Right.
don't read fantasy. What are you talking about? Because as a young woman, I was reading mostly realistic fiction and historical fiction. I love historical fiction. And just the idea of fantasy, to me, I was like, fairies and elves, who's writing about that? And then I discovered all these Black science fiction and fantasy writers, especially Octavia Butler. And suddenly I was like, what did I read as a child? And it was all fantasy. I mean, I did Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred D. Taylor. That was a really important book for me. And that's historical fiction. But, I read all these magical stories and they were all set in England and they generally involved a castle or dragons or something else. And I just thought, kids need to know that magic can happen to anyone, anywhere. And because I live in a big city, the kids I work with primarily live in big cities. I wanted them to know that their neighborhood could be a site of magic. And so I lived in Brooklyn for 20 years. And I personally still, as an immigrant, think of Brooklyn as a magical place. And I would just walk around and look at things in my neighborhood and be like, I'm going to write a story about that. I'm going to put that in my book. The Botanic Garden, let's put that in the book. The Prospect Park has these guardhouses that look like tiny castles. Let's make those time travel machines. I'm sort of drawing on the conventions that were in the books I read as a child, and then flipping them or putting them into an urban context so that I don't need a witch in Brooklyn who has green skin and a wart on her nose and a pointy black hat and rides a broom. My witch is going to be a Brooklynite and she's going to be, wearing a puffer coat.
Yeah.
Big afro. And, she's from Brooklyn. She's a Black woman who has spent her life living in cities. I'm thinking about writing a prequel right now so I can tell Ma's story, her childhood, because a student asked me why Ma was so grouchy.
Give a little backstory to that.
Yeah, I think the series works because people care about the characters. It's less about the world building. I mean, book 4, it'll be interesting to see its reception because it is set almost entirely in the realm of magic. And I think kids have certain expectations for what a realm of magic should look like. But even that, I wanted it to be patterned off of Madagascar, an island off the coast of Africa, decentering England as the source of all magic, because every culture has its own magical traditions and magical tales. And I hope that kids, read the book and get more interested in Madagascar, get interested in African mythology, and African American mythology and Chinese mythology. Like wherever you are, look around, because dragons don't only exist in England. Dragons are everywhere.
Right. Yep, no, absolutely. And just for anyone who doesn't know, without giving too much away, main character Jackson, just a boy in Brooklyn, sort of is thrust into this magical, well, you can describe it better than I can. Can you just give a brief synopsis of the series without giving too much away?
Okay, Jackson has to stay with a grouchy old lady one day while his mother goes to court. She is fighting eviction because gentrification is affecting Brooklyn, and even hardworking folks who are paying their rent are suddenly facing highly increased rents. So Mama's going to fight it, and she drops Jax off with Ma, and he discovers that Ma is actually a witch, and she has one last mission before she retires, which is to take 3 baby dragons to the realm of magic. But of course, they don't get all 3 where they're supposed to be. One gets left in Brooklyn because there's a dragon thief. And so Jax has to track down the dragon thief. And then once all the baby dragons are back in the realm of magic, something happens to Brooklyn. When you take away the influence of magic, the city starts to change. And so Jackson is allowed to attend the witches' convention, which is being held in Chicago. He goes with Ma, but she doesn't let him actually attend. And he's keeping a secret from her, which is that he has a baby phoenix in his pocket. So Jax is keeping his own store of magic, and Ma is trying to prevent changes happening in the realm of magic, Palmyra. But Jax ends up getting manipulated by a wizard, and he ends up going back to Palmyra in book 4 to convince the guardian Sis to open all the portals so that the magical creatures can have free passage back and forth between Palmyra and the human realm. So it's overall, I'd say the series is really about community and belonging. As an immigrant, obviously, I think a lot about that. But we're also in a climate crisis, and I want kids to think about how careful we are with our resources, and do we make other people who are from other places feel welcome in our communities? Do we actually respect the creatures that we share the planet with? So many creatures are going extinct. It's hard to imagine that there are children being born today who won't know some of the animals that we knew growing up, right? So the idea that a magical creature could be exploited, should it be protected? Should we have open borders? These are some of the larger themes that I imagine most children would not recognize necessarily. But it's fun for me to put it in there as subtext, because, kids care about unicorns and they care about dragons. And it's interesting to think about who gets called a monster and what does it mean to be a monster.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And I'm glad I had you do the synopsis. You did a wonderful job with that, much better than I could have. And just real quick before I move on, touching on something that you mentioned, just the role that urban geography plays. Like, it's so exciting to, all right, we're on Flatbush Avenue, we're in Prospect Park. Here's the magic portal in this sort of just stone, I'm not going to use the right word, but just this guardhouse. A guardhouse. And it's so neat because it's so accessible. And it, like to your point before, it's just magic can happen anywhere in, everyday environment. And it doesn't have to be in a fairy garden in England. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it. So
that's great. Thank you. There used to be a teacher in Brooklyn, Adam Marcus, who did walking tours based on books that were set in New York. And so kids could pick out landmarks, and then he would take them with the book and say, remember when this happened here and then this happened here. And I do hope kids walk around their neighborhoods with fresh eyes. In Chicago, it did the same thing here in Chicago. So, to just see your world a little bit differently.
Fantastic. We spoke about this a little bit before, but just bringing us back to the necessity for representation and children being able to see themselves in what they read. You're a self-described advocate for greater diversity and equity in publishing. So tell us about Jackson and who he is for those young readers. So Jackson, and then also, children of all backgrounds and all types of lives. I know that you have several books. Benny Doesn't Like to Be Hugged, which is centered on a child with autism. Room in My Heart, which touches on divorce. So whether it's Jackson, Benny, or any of these other characters, why is it so important that there be a book for every child to see, their situation, their life in literature?
Right. Well, there's a scholar, Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, who's written a really important essay called Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors. And she talks about how books, can end up really impacting a child's life into adulthood. So if you never see yourself in a book, that affects your self-esteem and your interest in reading. If you see yourself in a book constantly, that also affects your self-esteem. Right. If you're the center of the universe. A lot of people think that books that are inclusive are somehow like a gift or a favor you're doing for marginalized kids. And the truth is, these books are for everyone. If you're raising your child to live in a global society, then they need to read books that look like our global society. And you're doing them a disservice if you're not preparing them to engage with people who are different, because that's what our world is like. It's full of people who are different. So for me, having Jax, a boy who's lost his father, who's grieving in his own private way, who wants to help his mother, but his mother's trying to keep, their situation hidden from him. He definitely needs a mentor, an older person in his life. I was very close to my grandparents, so having an older Black woman seemed like a good fit. And Jax wants to contribute. I think every person, but certainly every kid, wants a chance to contribute and a chance to have their own particular skills recognized. It was important to me to have Kenny in the series. He joins us in book 2. And, Jax and Vic think, oh no, here's the class bully, this big kid, he's going to ruin everything. And it turns out Kenny's the sweetest, gentlest kid, and he's dyslexic. And he's the one who ends up cracking the code that gets them into the Emporium. So making sure that kids who have disabilities, kids who have different family structures. I grew up, with such a different family structure from everybody because my dad remarried a couple of times and I had step siblings and half siblings, and never saw that in a book, never saw a kid who had my name in a book, right? It's really important to me to think about having how I name my characters so that also shows inclusiveness. I think if you only have window books, if you're always watching someone else having fun, you can become white identified. I mean, I read so many books about white kids that when I started to write, I wrote about white kids because I didn't think I had the right to write about kids who look like me. I had no model for that. But I really hope that kids, can see this book and understand that there's a place for everybody in the realm of the imaginary, in the realm of magic.
Yeah, love it. Perfect. And then in your series, especially in book 3, it's peppered with sort of these pivotal moments, places, people, and themes from history, whether it's recent history or, long ago history. We've got African slaves going to India in book 2. Let's see, we've got talking about gender identity, the term mansplaining, which is, super relevant these days. We're talking about Jim Crow, Bronzeville in Chicago, the movement for Black Lives Matter, Breonna Taylor, speaking truth to power. All of these things are just, throughout the whole series. Which was wonderful to see. It's so current current in the things that are more recent, obviously, but then just exposing children, these young readers, to these crucial things throughout history. So what was your goal in including those, and what does that give to the middle schoolers who are reading these books?
Right. Well, I have to say, I'm a history geek. I'm someone who loves to read history. I love documentaries. I love looking at the past. And I'm more inclined to look at the past than I am to write futurist fiction, which is a big thing right now, Afrofuturism. But really, the principle of Afrofuturism is that time is cyclical. And so it's important to look at the past because we're going to be there again pretty soon if we're not careful. I really want kids to think history is exciting and interesting. And it seems to me that the hook is magic. And if you simply present children with historical facts, the way that history is often taught in schools, unfortunately, is quite boring. It tends to focus on historical figures. So every kid knows about Martin Luther King, his holidays coming up on Monday. They know about Rosa Parks, they know about the big key figures, which makes it seem like history is about important individuals. And that's not what history is. History is really about communities, and it's about collaborations, and it's about people who work together because they share values and principles. So I'm not interested in shaming anybody. I'm not interested in depressing anybody, but I am going to tell the truth. And I think it's a challenge for me that I enjoy, trying to very subtly insert a little bit of history so that I'm not preaching and I'm not, hammering anybody over the head, but I am taking you on a tour of my neighborhood, and I live in a historic neighborhood. Bronzeville was just named a federal historic district. Okay. So it's important to me to say, well, if we're going to have an annual witches convention, we need a building. What building should I use? Well, there's the Forum, right? Because they're renovating the Forum right now. They're fundraising. It's a historic building that was used for meetings by African Americans for over 100 years. So it's important to me to be able to say the neighborhood that you live in has a history. So kids are very keen on ghosts. I was not so much growing up. The kids are keen on ghosts. They love time travel. So finding a way, that's the hook, is to say the streets that you're walking on, the house that you live in, the building you pass on the corner, it's been there. And if you listen, it will testify, it will tell you, it will bear witness. And I can do a little bit of that while I'm telling a magical story. So I like to call it historical fantasy because I'm playing with some historical facts, but I'm also teaching while I'm doing it.
And you did it in such a beautiful way, because it just
you.
every instance was sort of just almost naturally occurring as they were walking, this street, that street, as they were having a conversation, and there was no point where it was, a lecture or anything like that. It was just so well done. So I really enjoyed that
Great.
throughout the books. Again, we've touched on this earlier in the conversation, but just some final words. What changes would you like to see in children's books and publishing in general? If you could sort of snap your fingers, although these things take time, what are some of the biggest changes you'd like to see in what kids are reading and what is being offered to kids?
Right. Well, curriculum is a big issue. I can write the books, but if teachers aren't adding them to the curriculum or to their library collections, even, I've had 3 books challenged and or banned, and that's frustrating. But again, we have a lot of books that don't even come into existence because doors are still being closed within the publishing industry. And that will continue to happen until the industry itself diversifies. And so we've been having these studies and reports that come out every year on the lack of diversity in publishing. We have people at HarperCollins on strike right now, in part because they aren't seeing any progress around diverse hires. So, we have issues with gatekeepers that needs to change. I would love to see more people looking beyond what's, face out in the big box bookstore or even in their indie bookstore. Indie bookstores, for the most part, don't support indie authors. So you'll find my Dragons in a Bag series at your local bookstore probably, but you won't find my self-published books. And people are self-publishing because they can't get the opportunity they deserve from the traditional industry. So I hope we can get to a point where people are aware of the range of books that are available, the range of books that we need, that kids deserve to have. I hope we continue to see resistance to the book banners. I'm really heartened by the way communities are coming together to insist on kids' right to read. Stories connect us, and everyone has a story to tell. So the more stories we have, the more representation we have, the better.
Fantastic. And if listeners and viewers want to check out some of your self-published work, where can they go to learn more about you and about what you've put out into the world?
Yeah, they can definitely start at my website, zettaelliott.com. I was so thrilled that bookshop.org, which came into being during the pandemic as an alternative to Amazon, bookshop.org carries a lot of my self-published books, so you can find them there. Amazon is my printer for the self-published books, so all of my books are available on Amazon. And yeah, you can follow me on social media for news about the upcoming releases. Chicken Wonders Why should be out at the end of January.
Oh, I'm excited.
I'm working on a book about a boy that was trafficked into Scotland in the 18th century, Blue Boy. So that should hopefully be out by March.
Well, you've got a fan in me and my daughter, so we're excited in the future to check out anything new that you put out. So thank you so much to Zetta Elliott for being here with us today to chat about her books and children's literature. And thank you to all of our viewers and listeners as well. Make sure you visit ChesapeakeFamily.com for up-to-date local information on home, health, and living for today's Maryland parent. This episode will be archived on ChesapeakeFamily.com in video and podcast format. I'm Laura Boycourt with Chesapeake Family Life and Third Floor Views. Thanks so much.